The motorsport world is full of fantastic and particular experiences, but there's one driver's life story that has always really fascinated me, that of Roberta Cowell. See, Cowell was a fighter pilot, a prisoner of war, and a racing driver, which alone would have been enough to build up an impressive resume. However, she was also the first documented person to receive gender-affirming surgery in the United Kingdom, making her the first known trans woman to compete in motorsport. Today, we're discussing her life and her experiences in an era where her mere existence was criminalized. Before we get started, I want to offer a disclaimer. As with all language concerning how we identify ourselves, the language surrounding the trans experience has dramatically evolved over the years. Many terms that were once widely accepted have fallen out of fashion, but more pressing for this episode is the fact that much of Roberta Cowell's experience is couched in medicalizations and psychoanalyzations that would be considered harmful today. Because this is an audio podcast and because I am a cisgender person, I will not be using any specifically outdated terms that are no longer used. However, because this is also a history podcast, I will be sharing some of the problematic aspects of Cowell's life and her transition. I intend to contextualize Cowell's experience by offering a contemporary understanding of what she describes, but I do want to acknowledge right off the bat that many of Cowell's words or experiences may be problematic or even harmful to someone who may be tackling complex questions about their identity or presentation. My intention with this episode, as with every episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, is to share a sympathetic recounting of the past while also illustrating how our mindsets have evolved. No human is perfect, and at the end of the day, Roberta Cowell is a human just like me and you. Her experiences deserve to be shared, but her mindsets should also be challenged, and I hope to offer a respectful challenge here. With all that being said, if you are not currently in a state of mind where you feel comfortable hearing about those experiences, I really recommend looking after yourself and skipping this episode. Likewise, if you are unable to be kind or respectful of an experience that may not reflect your own, I recommend you skip this episode as well. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. Before we delve exclusively into Roberta Cowell's story, I want to offer a little bit of contextualization. Normally, the early parts of my episode context will delve into politics or the racing world, but today I want to talk about the long and complex history of the transgender experience. For as long as humans have existed, and for as long as we have been able to perceive our identity and how that identity fits within the society in which we live, there have been trans people. We just probably didn't have a word for them. We probably would have known that the person in question challenged gendered norms, but there was perhaps no specific label to define that experience. Or perhaps that experience was not even considered to be outside of understood gender roles. In ancient Rome, for example, a group called the Galli were priests dedicated to the goddess Cybele. Here, people looking to join the Magna Mater, the name for the religion dedicated to Cybele, often castrated themselves and then adopted the clothing and jewelry of a Roman woman. As a result, the Galli could examine Rome's gender norms from a position outside of the traditional gender expression. In ancient Egypt, we had Hatshepsut, a pharaoh who was born a woman, but who adopted the traditionally masculinized forms of expression expected of a ruler. Her reign was marked by great prosperity and the organization of massive large-scale construction projects. In some African cultures, there are more than two gender expressions, and in others, priests adopt the physical expression of the opposite gender. That's considered divine. In indigenous cultures in North America, The term two-spirit was very recently adopted as an umbrella term to define various tribal experiences of third gender expressions, as in, they don't fit within our Western recognized idea of a binary, male and female. In South America, colonizers reported trans expressions in places like Brazil and Peru, where, in some societies, those third gender persons were absolutely revered. In certain Asian cultures, the trans experience has been readily documented for centuries. It wasn't until the early 20th century that European doctors and researchers really tried to medically define the trans experience. Given the technology and the scientific knowledge available at the time, that was a fairly clumsy process. In 1919, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld founded the Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin. There he carried out early examples of hormone therapy and crude attempts at gender confirmation surgery. But for a lot of researchers trying to define the trans experience, there was an instinct to pathologize that experience. See, even though we were loaded with unprecedented access to diverse cultures in the early 20th century, that access also could result in a concretization of your own culture. If you've ever gone to a friend's house as a kid and realized, for example, that they always have a glass of milk with dinner, whereas your family doesn't make you do that, you've probably experienced this concretization of culture. When you were served that glass of milk, you probably thought, that's weird. That's not how my family does it. And perhaps you felt that your experience was the normal one. That's a really low-stakes example of cultural concretization. Other examples include colonizers forcing their religions on colonized communities because the colonizers couldn't understand that a different community's way of living could be as valid as their own. And in the medical world, in the early 20th century, we had ideas of what we should see as normal, which basically meant you conformed to societal expectations regarding everything from the way that you did your hair to the kind of career you could achieve. Unfortunately, a lot of folks doing that medical work were wealthy white men, and so much of the medical literature that still dictates our ability to access care today assumes that at default, you're a wealthy white man. If you are anything else, a woman, a poor man, a person of color, or a member of the LGBTQ+ community, then you deviated from the default and would probably be diagnosed with some physical or mental ailment. As society has evolved, we've largely grown to understand that certain facets of one's identity can't just be pegged on a faulty gene somewhere in our makeup. Many aspects of who we are depend on the physical location where we were born, the socioeconomic status of our family, and the choices our ancestors made centuries ago. Many other aspects are just simple facts that have legitimate genetic origins that are not the result of any moral failings. Yes, if you are a human who exists on this earth, you've likely encountered someone who believes you are a bad person because of some unshakable aspect of who you are. But there's a much better chance that now you won't be institutionalized for, say, having hormone-related emotional fluctuations or for being born with red hair. In the early to mid-20th century, though, Western society was still in that flux state where we were slowly beginning to learn more hard scientific facts that could tell us perhaps that the simple fact of having a menstrual cycle was not indicative of a moral failure, but we were also still kind of trying to find something wrong with that because our social culture hadn't progressed along with the medical culture. This is the society in which Roberta Cowell transitions. Are you tired of the same old boring motorsport merchandise? Me too. That's why this season, Deadly Passions Terrible Joys is partnering with Homefield Apparel, a sporting apparel company that has released some exceptional collections inspired by the racing world. If you're looking for great shirts and hats designed in Speedway, Indiana, head down to the description to learn more about Homefield, and don't forget to use code DPTJ15 at checkout to get 15% off your first purchase. Robert Marshall Cowell was born in Croydon, London, England on April 8, 1918, to parents General Sir Ernest Marshall Cowell, KBE, CB, and Dorothy Elizabeth Miller. From here on out, I will be exclusively referring to Cowell as Roberta and using female she/her pronouns. Even though Cowell actively identified as a male for the first few decades of her life, I will be referring to her as a woman out of respect for her experience. Cowell attended Whitgift School, which was an all-boys public school, and her parents were both well-educated and in great standing with their community. Cowell struggled with religion and self-presentation as a child, but she soon found solace in just about anything that had wheels. First came an obsession with a scooter that she loved riding downhill at full bore, and that evolved into a love of all things mechanical as she approached her teenage years. At school, she joined the motor club, where she got early experiences learning how to drive motorcycles and cars, and she later joined the Officers Training Corps with the intention of one day becoming a fighter pilot. Doing so offered her opportunities to travel throughout Europe as a child. At 16, she left school to join General Aircraft Limited as an apprentice engineer, and she started turning up at the Brooklands racetrack, outfitted in a racing suit, in order to find any opportunity she could get to get hands-on experience working on race cars. When she turned 17, she wasted no time earning her license and began entering plenty of small local racing events. But she also enlisted in the Royal Air Force. It wasn't easy. During training, Cowell found that she readily succumbed to air sickness and was deemed unfit for flying. Instead, she had to find a new path and therefore entered the University College London to study engineering in 1936. There, she met a woman named Diana Carpenter, whom she later married, but her primary interest still remained in motorsport. In 1936, she won her class at the Land's End Speed Trial behind the wheel of O'Reilly. 3 years later, at just 20 years old, she owned 3 racing cars that she maintained herself, competing in both the Donington and Antwerp Grand Prix, among countless other events all around England. Such was her love of racing that she even brought a tiny bottle full of fuel and oil with her when she was sent off to war. When she sniffed the bottle, she was reminded of her favorite place to be, the racetrack. Even though she had been previously deemed unfit for flying, Cowell applied for a job at the Air Ministry and was instead given the opportunity to move up through the ranks by starting off in the Royal Army Service Corps. In June of 1941, she married Diana Carpenter and then quickly jetted off to join the Royal Air Force. This time, she passed her medical exam and avoided vomiting during a slew of aerobatics, and that was that. She began training as a fighter pilot, just as she'd hoped when she was a child. In her autobiography, she recounts a moment where she passed out while flying due to a lack of oxygen that resulted from a Spitfire malfunction. She came to and managed to fly her way back to her squadron's base, but that was only the beginning of her troubles. A few months later, her squadron was stationed outside of Belgium, where they were battling off Nazi troops. On November 18, 1944, Cowell was piloting one of 2 Typhoons on a low-level sortie over a small German town, but anti-aircraft fire damaged her plane. She couldn't bail out because she was flying too low. Instead, she had to effect a dead-stick crash landing. She made it to the ground unhurt, but German troops scooped her up. Roberta Cowell was a prisoner of war. She attempted to escape a few times early on in her capture, but both attempts failed, and she was brought to a POW camp deeper into Germany. In her autobiography, she details the 5 months she spent as a prisoner, where she taught automotive engineering classes and designed her ideal Grand Prix car to pass the time. Her account of that time was pretty harrowing. She writes of splitting one slice of bread with 14 other prisoners, and of being so hungry that she killed cats just to have some raw meat. She writes of a fellow prisoner who wrote a letter of thanks to a woman who had knitted a sweater for the Red Cross, a sweater that found its way to that prisoner in the POW camp. The woman wrote back, "I'm sorry to hear that you have received my sweater, as I had knitted it for a fighting man." Cowell also describes a serious aversion to any kind of homosexual behavior. While at the camp, she rejected a part in a play because her fellow inmates wanted her to act as a woman. Because she identified as a man at the time, she thought that playing a woman would make her appear homosexual and declined the role. She also writes of her disgust at any men who propositioned her or others in the camp. By April 1945, when it became clear that the Red Army was closing in, German soldiers attempted to evacuate the camp in which Cowell was held prisoner, but the prisoners refused to leave. Eventually, the German soldiers just abandoned the camp, which was soon found by the Red Army in the night of April 30th. Riddled with scabies and 50 pounds lighter, Cowell was soon sent back to England, where she, as well as her fellow prisoners, would be expected to find a new path in life. After she returned from World War II, Roberta Cowell began to wonder what was next for her. She writes in her autobiography that as a fighter pilot, she had never seriously considered what she should do after the war. She set up a small automotive engineering business with a business partner, but that fell apart, and she continued to throw herself in the racing world. It was only one of many ventures that she embarked on at the time, and by 1946, she had put together a stable that competed in events around Europe, including a Grand Prix at Rouen-les-Essarts, as well as a Brighton Speed Trials in the United Kingdom. However, even motorsport couldn't take Cowell's mind off of her unhappiness. See, as we mentioned, she was married, and she and her wife had had 2 daughters. They had purchased a beautiful home, and Cowell's businesses were starting to move well. But she reflects on this period in her autobiography that, quote, "I was not at all well, physically, and it seemed that something was drastically wrong somewhere." This seemed to come to a head when she watched the film Mine Own Executioner. The hero of that film, just like Cowell, was shot down by anti-aircraft fire, and her reaction in the theater was visceral. Quote, "I felt all of the pent-up emotion released that I must have experienced when my own plane was shot down, but this time I was an observer and was not so preoccupied with what I was doing that I could feel no emotion," she wrote in her autobiography. "Now I felt the full impact of stark terror, fear that I would be burnt alive, fear that I would be lynched by the soldiers, fear that I would be terribly injured by the crash. It was a full hour before I was able to pull myself together and walk shakily out of the cinema." While that wasn't necessarily the only aspect of her life that she was struggling with, that was a moment that helped convince Cowell to consider she needed to find a way to move forward from her experiences and to really find out who she was. So, still identifying as a man, she decided it was time to seek out a therapist. Here, I want to tread lightly. Psychotherapy in the late 1940s was drastically different than what we would consider to be therapy today, and Cowell initially opted to see a Freudian therapist. As she writes in her autobiography, this school of psychotherapy, founded by Sigmund Freud, generally ties everything in your life back to sex. Basically, Freud's work posits that our development as humans involves a series of pseudo-sexual progressions as we age. For example, infants explore the world by mouth, and the big focus in that period of their lives is seeking sustenance via mouth from their mother's breast. In the next stage, the child's attention turns to their ability to control their bowel movements. Freud posits that if there is any disturbance or discomfort or trauma associated with any of these stages of life, we will manifest those disturbances in our later sexual growth. There's just one problem. Scholars now believe that Freud's theories were developed by kind of ignoring rampant childhood sexual abuse in his patients. In effect, Freud's initial research was conducted by speaking with children and adults who often reported sexual abuse by other adults in their lives. The sheer number of people reporting that abuse was disturbing to Freud, and it seemed impossible to him that abuse could be so rampant. If it was true, it would result in a serious societal upheaval among the intellectuals and upper-class folks he was liaising with and who he counted on to do his work. Whether it was simply just too hard for him to believe, or whether society would have effectively decimated his career for reporting his findings, Freud built a school of psychoanalytic thought that posits these children were not actually necessarily abused, but that they experienced some seemingly benign disruption in their sexual development that compounded and manifested in fantasies or desires of abuse. But when Roberta Cowell headed off to pursue a Freudian line of treatment, society hadn't quite put all that together yet. That didn't happen until the late 1970s, when feminist scholars began to find that yes, many children who reported sexual abuse in childhood actually had been sexually abused. By speaking to a therapist, Cowell says that she learned, quote, the real conflict that she was facing, quote, was due to the dynamic energy of primary urges with their inhibiting elements which were denied expression. She described her dreams to her therapist, and he helped her work through their meaning. But it wasn't until she moved on to her next therapist that her world and self-perception changed. Her second therapist put her through a round of tests, word association, ink blot tests, and so much more. He came to the conclusion that her unconscious mind was, quote, predominantly female. Reflecting on this in her autobiography, Cowell wrote, I had confidently experienced that the result of the analysis would be a discovery of the fact that I had an unconscious fear of losing my masculinity. I expected to find traces of the Oedipus complex and signs of repressed conflict between animal instincts and moral upbringing. I did not expect to find that, freed of repressions, I was psychologically a woman. From here, Cowell goes on to share a lot of problematic rationale for her understanding that she was mentally and physically actually a woman. She points to typically feminine traits and to typically feminine secondary sex characteristics. These rationalizations helped her come to the conclusion that she should begin a physical transition and that she should begin living as a woman. Mentally, Cowell had accepted that she may be living inauthentically, but she needed physical confirmation as well, especially after a friend named Lisa made a passing joke about how Roberta should be using a brassiere. She visited a sexologist at Harley Street in London, who determined that Cowell had, quote, prominent feminine sex characteristics, like wide hips, narrow shoulders, a female-type pelvis, small hands and feet, no Adam's apple, and a typically feminine, though underdeveloped breast formation. Cowell also notes that there was, quote, some degree of hermaphroditism present. This kicked off a greater period of potential but conflicting medical self-discovery. Cowell says she visited gynecologists, endocrinologists, general practitioners, and even a professor of anatomy. They all seemed to agree that she exhibited more female characteristics than male characteristics, and that they were somehow surprised she was even as masculine as she was. Cowell says that with the medical confirmation, she now had a choice. She could continue to live as a man, though she says that in doing so, she would still have to undergo surgery and hormone therapy. Or she could live as a woman, again requiring surgery and hormone therapy. The latter option somehow seemed preferable, as Cowell felt that her body was trending in a more feminine direction. Let's pause here and take stock of where we're at. Cowell is effectively claiming that she is intersex, which means that her sexual characteristics and genitalia are not traditionally male or female. But Cowell is incredibly vague to an extent that people have theorized she maybe made this whole story up. Reading her biography, I can see how they've come to that conclusion. Cowell never actually names any sexual characteristics that she was born with, such as ovaries or testicles. She never really says she has them or does not have them. She breezes over a lot of the medical discussions and kind of asserts that her transness is more readily found in the way she feels about women's fashion. She later stated in an interview that she had XX chromosomes, but also a penis and testicles. But folks with that kind of intersex expression are generally infertile per current medical understanding, and Cowell had 2 children. Cowell also makes another compelling claim. Mainly, she says her doctors were unclear whether or not she was born with these characteristics, or if they were kicked off by the trauma she experienced as a prisoner of war in World War II, or due to the flashbacks she experienced afterward. She seems to imply that this latter suggestion is the more likely one, that a post-war shock led to a change in her glandular structure, but she also notes somehow that her doctors said her body had been slowly making this transition for years. Basically, there is a lot of ambiguity here, and it seems a little fantastic that Cowell would have no indication that she exhibited female sex characteristics until she visited multiple doctors, who all universally agreed that she did so. But it's not totally impossible. Perhaps the most gracious explanation here is that Cowell is a trans woman who is attempting to present an explanation of her existence to a society that otherwise would not accept her. At the time, it was illegal to perform certain gender-affirming surgeries. However, there was enough ambiguity surrounding intersex expressions of genitalia that identifying as intersex could have provided the necessary legitimacy for Cowell to gain access to the health care she needed to make a full transition. This is something you'll see fairly regularly in stories about folks undergoing these early gender transitions. It's not necessarily that this person is lying about their existence, so much as it is that they are trying to present the most socially acceptable version of that narrative to have their experiences legitimized. Cowell positioning herself as existing between both binary genders and having to select one to fully become does a lot to take the burden off of her shoulders and makes it perhaps easier for others to understand why a surgical transition was necessary. It is, however, still an appropriation of the intersex experience or the experience of having been born with ambiguous genitalia, and I want to make it clear that this mindset should not be encouraged. Claiming to have been born or to have become an intersex person has historically offered some trans people the ability to undergo a transition in a way that may seem more legitimate or medically necessary than transitioning without any clear medical need. That has created a lot of confusion about the actual intersex experience, and a lot of queer scholars are still doing the work of untangling the knots that have arisen when trans and intersex experiences overlap. Cowell writes of the pain and embarrassment that she felt throughout her life, but when she makes the commitment to begin adopting a more typically female expression, she says, "This knowledge raised my morale very considerably. The intense shame I felt began to disappear. Once I realized that my femininity had a physical basis, I didn't despise myself so much. I now knew, of course, that I was physically abnormal, but I could accept a degree of involuntary femininity without losing self-respect." I think that quote sheds a lot of light onto perhaps why Cowell presents her life story the way she does. She really removes herself from the process of discovery and instead presents her transition as being almost out of her control. She never seems to note any complex feelings about her gender expression, not until she's told to see doctors and psychologists who basically just tell her that she's trans, and that this is something that her body has effectively begun pursuing without any input from her. She doesn't ever really make any decisions for herself so much as she lets others make them for her, and I think that can do a lot to illustrate the fact that she simply may not have felt like she could determine her gender presentation for herself. It may have been easier for society to accept her if she presented a story that this was largely something she had no control over, especially when she goes on to write about her family medical history, where she alleges that she had an aunt born with a congenital absence of a vagina. When she decided that she was going to commit to a typically feminine presentation, Cowell first started hormone therapy. She writes that this process made her look younger, that it cleared her skin, and reduced her muscle mass. Allegedly around this time, people also began to look at her and noticed that she didn't conform exactly to their expectations of what either a man or a woman should look like. This was a very difficult time in Cowell's life. She felt that she could see people staring at her and that she wasn't quite sure exactly who she was yet. But as the hormones transformed her appearance, Cowell said that she realized she would, quote, have to give it up sometime, or that she needed to commit to a surgical transition. After 2 years of hormones, she visited a doctor that determined her to be legally intersex, which allowed her to re-register her gender on her birth certificate, which would, in turn, allow her to undergo a surgical operation. However, if you just read her biography, she makes this sound a lot easier than it was. In the Queer as Fact podcast, the hosts read a document that Cowell had signed. Basically, because she couldn't find anyone to perform her surgery, she therefore agreed to undergo surgery by an unqualified doctor with only 5 years of medical training, someone who had never performed this kind of surgery before. This document was legally necessary, if only to absolve the doctor of any legal blame should Cowell die from the procedure. The man performing the surgery was a trans man named Michael Dillon. Cowell first met Dillon through his publisher after he wrote a book about becoming the first person to receive gender-affirming surgery to give him a penis. Cowell doesn't share much about the relationship between the two of them, but the assumption is that she was looking to Dillon to help her access surgical care for herself. When Dillon couldn't find anyone to do it, he opted to conduct the procedure. Basically, what was going on here was that Cowell was stuck. In order to legally change her sex on her birth certificate, she needed to remove her testicles. And at the time, laws in the UK prevented doctors from surgically removing otherwise healthy testes. Should Dillon successfully perform the operation, then Cowell could visit the other doctors who would provide her with the paperwork necessary to say that she didn't have functioning testes. She just needed to get rid of them first. After that point, in the eyes of the government, she could legally change her sex, and she would be able to pursue further gender-affirming surgery at a later date with doctors who were confident that they wouldn't be arrested for doing so. This entire procedure of removing testicles is completely ignored in Cowell's biography. Not only was it illegal, but it was also highly dangerous and threatened to harm the medical standing of Dillon, who performed the surgery. After she was legally able to change her sex, it was 1952 that she underwent the first recorded gender-affirming surgery in the United Kingdom by Sir Harold Gillies. He performed Dillon's gender-affirming operation as well. Cowell reports that it took 6.5 hours, though she also says she felt no pain. A great result, considering Gillies' only experience with performing the surgery had come the night before, when he had practiced on a corpse. 2 weeks later, she was able to return home. The operation made a tremendous difference to me psychologically, Cowell wrote in her autobiography. I felt quite different and very much happier. The results were almost miraculously good, and I was very glad indeed to have this art of the metamorphosis completed. Shortly after she returned to life as she knew it, though, Cowell realized she was also interested in undergoing facial surgery to, quote, remove any residual traces of masculinity, and also to make herself a little prettier in the process. She moved to a new apartment and soon made her first forays out into public as a woman, where Cowell reflects on the sense of approval she received from men who found her attractive. Soon, she began to find her sense of style, learned how to apply makeup, and began to carry herself differently. One of the more compelling parts of her autobiography touches on the contradictory advice she received regarding diets, makeup, and more, something she had never had to deal with when she was presenting as a man. She describes the struggle she felt coming out to her parents and the struggle she had with dating. Soon, though, Cowell was faced with new challenges. Namely, she notes the appearance of other trans people popping up in the media, such as Christine Jorgensen. Jorgensen was an American who underwent gender-affirming surgery in Denmark, and this is something to which Cowell takes serious exception. See, Cowell may have transitioned herself, but as we've touched on a few times already, she had a very particular justification for her transition, namely that it was medically necessary because she stated she was an intersex person. When it comes to anyone but herself, however, Cowell can be severely queerphobic. She speaks of disgust about gay men and derided Jorgensen because Jorgensen was, quote, never a person with two sets of sexual characteristics, one being dormant. Cowell continued, quote, the distinctive feature of this case was, of course, the fact that the change was apparently artificially induced, meaning Jorgensen had seemingly no physical or medical basis upon which to occasion her transition. Cowell also makes fun of other trans people she meets when those people don't conform to a more conventional masculine or feminine experience. You can really tell that she still adheres strictly to a gender binary and that she has no space in her understanding of queer culture to see anything else. As she got older, it seemed that those views became more extreme. In a story published in the Sunday Times, in which it was reported that Cowell was looking to get back to motorsport in 1972 at the age of 53, She takes an extremely dim and controversial view of her own transition and of the people that have allegedly mimicked her. "I was a freak," she was quoted as saying. "I had an operation and I'm not a freak anymore. I had female chromosome makeup, XX. The people who have followed me have often been those with male chromosomes, XY. So they've been normal people who've turned themselves into freaks by the operation." Later she goes on to say, "Many people thought they could copy me, but it's like admiring someone without legs and having your legs off to be the same. Or it's more like seeing a thalidomide child and having the operation to be the same." Obviously, these are not acceptable mindsets. Anyone can transition for any reason. It does not need to have a medical basis. But Cowell was firm in her belief that she had a legitimate transition and many other trans people did not. The 1972 story goes on to say that she disagrees with the women's liberation movement, that she doesn't agree with the blurring of gender lines, and that she claims women and men are so different as to be different species. In 1954, Cowell was offered a significant sum of money to tell her story to the press. It's not exactly clear if someone found out about Cowell and told her that they were going to sell her story before her. It's also entirely possible that Cowell told the press herself. She really needed money, and she was being offered thousands of pounds just to have her story told. The autobiography I'm referring to in this episode is effectively the story that got published in the papers, and it was a huge sensation in both the US and the United Kingdom. By the time her story was published, Cowell had left the UK, determining it was best to probably be out of the country when it hit the press. And that turned out to be a good thing. Journalists dug up everyone from Cowell's past that they could find, including some of her former doctors and even her father, who would claim that Cowell had either been a normal boy or that she had reported them saying things that they felt had been misinterpreted, misquoted, or were entirely untrue. Rather than continue any sympathetic or sensationalist coverage, the press instead began sharing scandalous tidbits about Cowell, claiming that she was a, quote, transvestist, or effectively that she was a man who found sexual thrill in wearing women's clothes. People began demanding her birth certificate be amended to declare her a man, while others denied her entire experience outright. That nasty reporting circled around for a while until it faded out of the press, and Cowell remained out of the country until it had kind of gone undercover. We don't really know much about Cowell after her coming out, at least not until after her death in 2011 at the age of 93. She did continue racing, even winning the Shelsley-Walsh Hill Climb in 1957, but she declared bankruptcy the following year. As the 1960s kicked off in full force, she found it very difficult to secure employment without effectively bringing negative press to her employer. She still continued racing into the 70s and even logged over 1,600 flight hours because racing and flying were her all-consuming passions in life, but she really wasn't doing much else. In the 1990s, she moved into sheltered accommodation, which is effectively a kind of rented housing for vulnerable communities. She died in obscurity on October 11, 2011. No one, not even her family, was aware that Cowell had died until The Independent published a posthumous profile on her and reached out to her daughters to ask if they had a comment. The story published in The Independent is painful. It begins, quote, 2 years ago, a 93-year-old woman died alone. She was found lying on the bedroom floor of her sheltered housing accommodation in West London. The flat was so cluttered that the wardens struggled to remove her body. Half a dozen people attended the cremation, and news of her death did not spread beyond Twickenham. This is not how Roberta Cowell should be remembered. The paper contacted Cowell's two daughters, Anne and Diana, who did not know that Cowell had died. Cowell had last spoken to her daughters in 1948 when she had gotten a divorce from her wife, and Cowell had avoided contact with them in the later years of her life, even though her daughters wrote letters seeking to reconnect. Nobody told me about the sex change, Diana, the younger of Cowell's two daughters, is quoted as saying in The Independent. I read about it in the newspaper. They were trying to protect me, but it was the biggest shock of my life. I must have been 12 or 13. The worst thing was that suddenly I knew this was reality. Your father's not coming back to you. Ever. And that's why it hurt so much. Diana is later quoted as saying, "It's a relief to know something at last." And that, quote, "I was 17 when I got married and had my first child at 18. I think part of me wanted to prove that there was nothing wrong with me." "I just think it's sad we could never be friends," Anne, Cowell's eldest daughter, said, "especially now that we know she died alone in sheltered housing." Cowell was buried not with flowers, but with a white enamel sign reading Roberta Cowell Racing in bright red letters. She'd had it made up in hopes that she could start another racing business. Roberta Cowell's story is a complex one, but it's one that I felt was deeply important to share in Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys for one specific reason. Establishing the roots of visibility to show that trans folks have had a long and storied history of participation in the motorsport world is hugely important. As we've touched on in other episodes centering on women or people of color, motorsport history is often written in such a way that it centers around a white, wealthy male experience. In much the same way that it's important to note that women and black folks have been part of the racing world for ages, so too is it important to note that trans people have been here for just as long as well. Roberta Cowell states several times in her biography that after she transitioned, she lost all inclination towards so-called masculine things like motorsport, but that was pointedly not true. She did step away from the racing scene while she was actively transitioning, the same way that she stepped away from a lot of public-facing life during that period. But both before and after her transition, Cowell was a regular fixture behind the wheel. As an early example of a trans person experiencing gender-affirming surgery, Roberta Cowell is full of contradictions and problematic mindsets. Her queer phobia is impossible to deny, as is her belief that she was somehow a legitimate trans person, compared to other illegitimate trans folks who had no medical basis for transitioning. These mindsets are harmful. They are problematic in the extreme, and they should not be looked upon as an example of appropriate conduct. Again, anyone should be allowed to transition for whatever reason. If it makes them happy and that is how they feel that they should live their life, that should be their prerogative. But the reason I want to share these problematic mindsets with you is the fact that history is never straightforward or simple. Cowell should be commended for her strength in pursuing an authentic form of self-expression, even though it was both socially reprehensible and also literally illegal. But her belief in her superiority over other members of the LGBTQ community, as well as the harmful perpetuation of mindsets about who should be allowed to transition, need to be held to task. More than anything else, though, I want to show that we should always be creating space for all kinds of diverse experiences in racing, because all kinds of people have always been involved in motorsport. Cowell may have been problematic, but she also clearly showed that she deserved to have a place behind the wheel. I'll take it a step further to say that all trans people should be welcome in racing, the same way that all women, all people of color, all members of the LGBTQ+ community, and more deserve to feel welcome in racing. Thankfully, we've made a lot of progress when it comes to representation in motorsport across the board. As far as the transgender and LGBTQ+ community goes, organizations now exist to promote and support all members of the queer community in the racing world, and many people are no longer afraid to be themselves in paddocks and grandstands. We also have fantastic ambassadors of the trans experience actively competing these days, like Charlie Martin. But things are very, very far from perfect. Trans folks are over 4 times more likely than cisgender people to be victims of violent crime, much of it stemming from prejudice and hate. There is still ample pushback against the mere existence of trans people, with fear and paranoia running rampant in courtrooms and in legislatures around the world. In motorsport, gender nonconforming people often face insurmountable barriers based on unreasonable and unfounded biases about their capabilities. This is unacceptable. I wanted to tell the story of Roberta Cowell to show that trans people exist in motorsport and that they have for decades. I wanted to pay a respectful tribute to a pioneer of queer history while also clarifying the misconceptions about queer folks that even Cowell possessed. More than anything, I want to reinforce my firm belief that motorsport is for everyone and that we all deserve a place in the racing world. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. In the next one, we'll be talking about Achille Varzi, the racing driver who nearly lost his career to a morphine addiction. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, leave a review, and also subscribe to the DPTJ Patreon. Up on my Patreon right now are some exclusive interviews that I had with people like Janet Guthrie and Jim Hall, and you'll also have access to newsletters rounding up the biggest events of the week that you should be paying attention to. If you want to send an email, I also have an address for that, deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. I want to extend a huge thank you to my DPTJ World Champions Ryan Lorman and Nicole Washington, the two icons battling neck and neck to become the most iconic member of the DPTJ family. Thank you to both Ryan and Nicole. It's a big ask to support creators the way that you have, and this show could not exist without the kindness and generosity of people like you. Thank you again. I also want to read a great comment I received from my good friend Rick, who wrote on my previous episode of the Chaparral 2J, quote, "I've been a sports car fan since I was 11 in 1964, and the Chaparral was my favorite car. I had slot cars and static models of many cars, and I still have them 60 years later. Elizabeth, you did a great job on this podcast. I thoroughly enjoyed listening." Rick, you are an absolute star. I always look forward to hearing what you have to say, and thank you again for your kind words. Finally, don't forget to check out Home Field Apparel to stock up on some incredible motorsport merch, and don't forget to use code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. Finally, we're ending with L'Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each show. The full list is also available in the episode description. First and foremost, I have to pay a special thank you to my wonderful friends Rachel, Ryan, Remy, Lauren, Jules, Jess, and several others who reached out to offer their feedback and advice regarding this piece. I am a cisgender person, but I wanted to make sure that my portrayal of Roberta Cowell was both historically accurate and rooted in contemporary understandings of the trans experience. I understand how crucial it is to share these stories with care, and I'm grateful to everyone who offered advice, read excerpts from the episode, and shared their thoughtful feedback. This show, again, could not exist without the kindness of people like you guys. I also want to give a shout out to the Queer is Fact podcast. The show has a great episode on Roberta Cowell that I've linked below, which really helped me think about how to discuss Cowell's experiences in a respectful but critical way. The rest of that podcast is great as well, so make sure you go catch up on their backlog. It's fascinating. I also heavily referred to Cowell's biography, as well as several newspaper and academic sources describing Cowell's life. Again, you'll find them in the description below. Thank you once more for listening to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. I'll see you next time.